Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. So I'm Tamina, usually co-host these sessions with Sue, but Jim will be presenting today and he will be presenting on designing clear assessment tasks for student success. So hopefully it should be a useful session for everyone who's joined today. Thank you, Jim.
Over to me. Thanks, Tamina. That's great. So, yeah, as Tamina's just said, today we'll have a bit of an exploration of how to design clear assessment tasks to make sure that students, and I'm going to use that term throughout the session, students, because of course we could be talking students at university, we could be talking candidates for the Reg portfolio, we could be talking people undergoing specialist or higher qualifications. So I'll use the term student relatively generically because most of what we're talking about today can be applied to those different levels that we're all training and assessing at in the workplace. So designing clear assessment tasks is actually all about asking the right question. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. In a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about today, when my PowerPoint works properly, what I'm going to talk about today is how assessment is used, why we use it the way we do, and what we're trying to get out of it. Because those three angles really lead us to asking the right question. Assessment itself is all about judging or deciding the value or importance of something. And the key here is that particularly when we're working with trainees and support staff and people who are kind of fresh in inverted commas out of university, they put an awful lot of weight in the value of an assessment in terms of a number and in terms of as a result. And one of the key things about asking the right question in a workplace and in work-based training is about getting students away from that idea of a value, of a number, and of a result per se. And so, as we're talking about asking the right question today, part of it will be about that transition of getting students away from it's a right answer versus a wrong answer. It's a top marks answer versus just, barely scratching the surface of the material that's required. So in our context, assessment is about a process of going through and setting people up for success rather than setting them up for failure. And fundamentally, in setting people up for success, today we need to touch on 3 or 4 aspects of assessment. It's not just about asking the right question, it's about making sure that the student has been scaffolded so that when you do ask them the question, they are primed to give you the right answer rather than a different level of expectation or something else that's just not aligning properly with the student and what you're asking them to do. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk very briefly about all aspects of the assessment cycle, about planning assessments, about implementing them, about evaluating and marking them, and then about rinsing that idea set and repeating it again. The thing that I want to focus on most today is this implementation phase, how you implement a well-written assessment and how an assessment becomes, in inverted commas, well written. And in order to do that, and in order to focus on this section, we do need to talk about the planning phase and the kind of post-assessment evaluation, because they will all feed in to making sure that the questions that are being asked are the right questions in the right context at the right time. So we'll come back to this diagram at 3 or 4 points during today's session. The first thing is making sure that we're setting students up for success by appropriate planning. And it's this bit, it's the planning phase that often starts a trajectory down bad assessment routes, because if the plans aren't laid properly, then the assessments that you generate from those plans will never be right. So thinking about that planning phase, thinking about the context of the assessments that we're setting is the first step. In our context, training in a workplace at whatever level, we're all about evaluating knowledge, skills, and competencies. And all three of those require different assessment strategies to be done really well. As you start digging into assessment strategies, particularly if you're doing things like the certificate in expert practice in training and things like that, you will very quickly come across the fact that there are three kind of key assessment domains that you'll see referred to all over the place. The first one is diagnostic assessment, and this is really good assessment that's used to evaluate prior knowledge. You'll often find that this kind of diagnostic assessment stuff just happens naturally. You very often start with a question such as, tell me what you know about diabetes, tell me what you know about how to produce a blood film. These diagnostic assessments are all about establishing pitch, and they can be a really useful planning tool when you are new to training in particular, to just help understand what the prior knowledge is that people are coming in with. The thing with diagnostic assessment is that it's massively underrated. Just asking a couple of little, really well-placed questions about what somebody's preconceptions are, prior knowledge are, prior experience is, can really help you establish the pitch for the session that's coming. So just as I did at the start of this poll, are you responsible for writing training material and assessments? It allows me to establish, when we get to that stage of today's session, I can just bump up the pitch a little bit, because there is a lot of prior experience in the room that I can maybe tap into as we go through some of this stuff. Formative assessment in a university context is assessment that doesn't count towards formal progress through a qualification. Often in lower level qualifications particularly, formative assessments takes the form of draft submissions and that kind of thing. Formative assessment is most useful for students because it allows them to get some scale and scope on whether the work that they are doing is the kind of thing that you're looking for. So formative assessment is good to give students an understanding of the expectation that's on them and build confidence. But it's also really good for us as trainers because it allows us to just steer students back onto track if they're getting things wrong. And it also allows us to check that the material that we are delivering, that the material that we're asking them to complete as part of that assessment, is landing appropriately. So it gives us an ability to have an intervention if necessary. Summative assessment in a university context is the stuff that counts towards progress. By and large, in things like the Reg portfolio, summative assessment is the evidence that ultimately you are going to be signing off and you are going to be marking. So although those three domains exist and are very common whenever you start to search on assessment strategies, by and large, in our context in the workplace, the majority of the assessment we do is this summative assessment because it counts towards progress of students completing a qualification, completing a learning aim, whatever it might be. For that reason, if you start using terminology like this in the workplace, students, and particularly recent graduates, will see it as high stakes stuff. They'll see it as assessment that matters. So just be careful if you're starting to use that terminology, that you're using it appropriately so that students kind of get the scale and scope. The other thing that you'll come across quite often when you start looking at assessments and how to create and plan assessments are the two key paradigms. The first one is norm referenced, and the second key paradigm is criterion referenced. The reason that I've put these two comparators in as a slide today is because, again, particularly new employees, people who are fresh out of university and new into the workplace, are very familiar with norm referenced assessments. They're given a grade. That grade is used to rank them either in terms of first, second, and third in the class, or first 2-1, 2-2 degree categories, that kind of thing. So norm referenced assessment is what students come to expect because of the schooling and university system that we use in this country. By contrast, most of the assessments that we deliver in the workplace, thinking things like the reg portfolio, the specialist portfolio, that kind of thing, they are criterion referenced assessments where instead of students being ranked as really good or best or bottom of the class, whatever it might be, students are linked to a set of predetermined criteria that just require mastery. And so it can often be quite jarring for a student to move out of a system where they are given a number feedback or a grade feedback to be given feedback based on criteria, to say you're demonstrating this particular point really well, but you're not quite there on whatever the other point might be. For that reason, part of designing the right question is making sure that students understand that it's not about the intrinsic value of whether they get the answer right or wrong, which is what it would be in a norm referenced system. The right question in our context is about making sure that students understand that it's about them demonstrating mastery of a list of criteria at a particular point in time. They don't have to demonstrate all of this all at once, but at a particular point in time, at the point of verification, for example, for the reg portfolio, that's when they've got to have demonstrated mastery of all of these criteria holistically. And it can often take a little bit of work to just steer a student away from needing to get, the best result, the highest mark, the best answer at the first crack of the whip, through to actually, I now understand that it's not just about this one or these two criteria, it's about all of them together collectively as a whole at the end. When it comes to creating effective assessments, that assessment cycle is really good for us as trainers and educators and practitioners to make sure that we're doing that whole process of developing an idea, implementing the idea, and evaluating what comes out as a result of that. But when it comes to writing an individual assessment piece, it's really important that it considers 4 different aspects. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes going through all of them before we then start putting this into practice with some examples about different assessment types and why they're good and why they're bad in different situations. The first thing that we need to consider is the validity of an assessment. And this is whether the assessment measures what you want it to measure. And as people who are educated, professional, and knowledgeable, this validity question is often the hardest one to get right, because to make sure that an assessment is measuring what you intend it to measure, you've got to make sure that you're being objective about the thing that you're trying to understand that the student knows. It's all very well and good thinking, well, I want to ask questions about Cox postulates, so I'll do X, Y, and Z. But what you've got to make sure for an assessment to be valid is that your understanding of these things matches what everybody else's understanding is. And so the key to an assessment being valid is that the framework that you are using to write the questions, the framework that you are using to evaluate knowledge against, needs to be in and of itself correct, but then also consistent amongst everybody. If you asked a colleague of yours to write 5 questions on Cox postulates and then you answered them, would you give the same answer that they give? Because if you don't, then there's a validity issue here. The easiest way to ensure that assessments are valid is to make sure that the questions you ask, the tasks that you give to students, are aligned to a set of learning outcomes. And that's why we need to look at that full assessment cycle as part of setting the right question, because the key to an assessment being valid is that it aligns with learning outcomes, because learning outcomes are very often consistent across the board. The second key point to an assessment being effective is that it is reliable. And this is that you will get consistency in results. If you were to give the same question or the same questions to 10 different students who all get that question right, if you were to read those 10 different answers, are they actually all the same? Or is it that because you've marked one of them and you knew what that student meant, even though they didn't use the words that you were hoping for, you gave them the benefit of the doubt? So you can see here how reliability is, in some contexts, a synonym for objectivity. Are you being objective in what you are reading? Are you consistently using the same words to give the same level of credit in a particular assessment task? And again, when we look at some examples in a few minutes' time, we'll pick up on the reliability issue again. Reliability in our context in the workplace is most often a problem when you have lots of different trainers marking the same sets of questions, all of whom know the different candidates to a different degree. Oh, well, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here because I know what they mean. Well, how do you know what they mean? How do you know that they didn't mean the words that are actually on the page rather than how you are interpreting those words? So reliability is a key factor. A really good way of overcoming issues with reliability in assessment, particularly if you're part of a big training team, is making sure that you've got really clearly defined grading criteria. The third one is fairness, and that is, are you giving all students an equal opportunity to develop and demonstrate their learning? Not everybody is good at the same kind of question. So might be that you were really good at university at essay-based questions, but not everybody is. Some people absolutely love multiple choice, other people hate it. Some people really like the opportunity to talk about what they've learned and perhaps give you a bit of a practical demonstration. Other people really struggle with it. So fairness is about making sure that students are given an equal opportunity to develop and to demonstrate their knowledge. And an easy way to implement fairness in assessment, particularly, I'll use the Reg portfolio as an example again, with the two candidate choice pieces of evidence. Why don't you just mix it up a bit? And you might have a series of written questions. You might ask them to generate some kind of leaflet or patient information booklet or whatever it might be. So if you choose different assessment types, then fairness becomes less of a problem because you allow naturally, with different assessment types, people to play to their strengths. It's really important as well to make sure that for an assessment to be fair, that they're free from bias. So if you do quite a lot of interdepartmental training, make sure that when you're giving an assessment to a student, that you're not asking them to do something that they can't do because they don't do it in their discipline, or because it's not something that they're expected to do in their particular job role or something like that. The other thing, I mean, the example I've put here is that if you're asking a student to identify a particular characteristic of a tissue section, make sure that every candidate that you're asking to do it has got access to equal quality microscope slides, just so that you're not inadvertently limiting the ability of the student to demonstrate whatever it is that you're asking them to show you. The fourth aspect is impact. Now, impact here is the impact on the learner, the impact of the assessment on the particular student. Yes, We are assessing students to check that they are safe to practice, that they are developing in their career, that they are demonstrating the higher level skills, whatever it might be. But fundamentally, the learning that has taken place as a result of the training that led to the assessment that you're looking at now needs to have impact on that particular student. And the way that that impact is maximised is through meaningful feedback to guide improvement. Now, that meaningful feedback needs to be honest, of course, and most of the time it will include some example of kind of critical feedback where you're saying, oh, you've not quite got this right. But as well as saying what a student's got wrong, you also need to say why the student went down that incorrect path, or why you have provided the critical feedback in the way that you have. Because it's only in the student's understanding of why you have given that feedback that the work is wrong, that they will be able to reflect on that properly and kind of develop for the next stage. Okay, so we've had a quick look there at what an assessment should be. It should be valid, reliable, fair, and it should be impactful. To make sure that that translates into the right question, into a successful assessment, it's really important that you follow some key steps. First of all, define what the criteria for success need to be. And as we'll see in a second, it comes from effective learning outcomes. The instructions need to be really clear, not just in terms of go and answer these questions and upload it into one file, or go and answer these questions and put it into your Brightspace portfolio. What's the format that you're expecting the work to come back to you in? Are you expecting it to be a 2-page document of continuous prose? Are you asking for a poster? Are you asking for a poster that's targeted at a specific user group, for example? What are your expectations in terms of referencing? Are you happy for the student to use AI as part of this submission? If you provide clear instructions to manage the expectation, it makes our job as trainers and practitioners when we're marking the assessments that we get in much easier, because the expectations were clear from the outset. And what that means is that we're setting the students up for success. By making the expectation clear, students are set up in the right way to give you their best approximation of the information that you're looking for at the first attempt. Nobody goes out there and completes assessment work to deliberately get it wrong. It just doesn't happen. When students come back to us with a complete misinterpretation of what we've asked them to do, it's rarely because they've done that deliberately. It's most often because we haven't defined clear criteria for success, or we haven't provided clear instructions. Make sure that tasks are appropriate for the level. So don't try and reuse tasks across multiple different qualifications without at least considering the impact of that on the student that's doing that qualification. And make sure that you're choosing the right assessment format. As we'll see in a minute, some assessment formats are much better at getting to the bottom of certain types of knowledge than others. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction into what assessment's all about. How do we get to the point where we're having an effective assessment? I'm going to just go through 1 or 2 slides now on sound learning outcomes, because it's the learning outcomes, getting those right, that makes the questions that we ask from that easier to generate, better for the student to answer, and fundamentally much more fun to everybody to engage with. The other reason I've put a couple of slides in on learning outcomes is because it's one area where we see very inconsistent practice across the country, in that a lot of learning outcomes that we see aren't actually learning outcomes at all. So, as a definition, a learning outcome describes what a student should be able to do after completing a period of training. And the key point with a learning outcome is that it defines what the learner can do. It's written from the learner's perspective. It uses appropriate command verbs that are relevant to the level of study. So you give student a specific command verb. You must be able to explain, you must be able to illustrate, you must be able to analyze or discuss. It's that command verb in the learning outcome that will give you the best chance at asking the right question in the assessment that you generate to assess these learning outcomes later. So it's really worth spending time getting the command verb in particular in the learning outcomes right. Again, as you look into assessment theory, one of the ideas that you will come across really, really early in the reading that you do is this idea that a learning outcome is SMART. And in this context, a SMART learning outcome is something that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, using this example at the bottom of the screen here, we'll just give that SMART acronym a bit of an exploration. So it's specific. Well, this example learning outcome here is specific in a number of ways. It's specific because it says at the end of this session. It's specific because it's limited to Cox postulates. It's measurable because a student will be able to explain it. Okay, the key thing about measurability is can you assess it? Can you assess understanding? Well, no, not really, because how you understand it might be different to me. Can you assess whether somebody explains something well? Yes, you can. So an explanation is an example of a measurable and achievable outcome for a learning objective, a learning outcome. Is it relevant? Yes, because I need them to know this as part of their work. Is it time bound? Yes, I want them to be able to do it at the end of this session. So learning outcomes are very much learner centric. The key to getting them right is that they are SMART. And the most common issue that affects learning outcomes is that they're not SMART. And so that then feeds through into assessments that are not great. So a good learning outcome, describe the principle of H&E staining, including the role of each reagent and the cellular components they target. It's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, it's time-bound. An example of a learning outcome that might require improvement is that a student understands H&E staining and why is it important. Well, this is bad because it's a bit vague. What does understand mean? What is important and why is it important and how is it important? So a good learning outcome gives the student several key things that they can say, right, I need to be able to describe. I need to be able to describe the cellular components that are targeted here. One of the things that I used to do in academic practice is I used to get students, particularly kind of first year undergrads, to highlight, what are the key terms here in these learning objectives? Because that allows me, as the person that's ultimately going to be assessing them, to check that they're starting off by understanding what I actually want them to learn over the next week, couple of hours, whatever it might be. Again, another example here, practically demonstrate. So a student knows straight away that if this is the learning outcome, it's likely that in an assessment later on, I'm going to have to show somebody how to do this or how I do this or how I implement that in practice. Again, contrast that with learn about how tissues are stained. So good learning outcomes generally write their own assessments, and those assessments are then set up so that students will succeed. I've said already that quite often what we see is that learning outcomes aren't learning outcomes at all. Often what we see are learning objectives as we're looking at what other people do. So it's important to just highlight the difference. The key with a learning outcome is that it's learner-centric and focuses on what the learner will achieve. Whereas a learning objective is about what you as the trainer will deliver and how you will deliver it and what you will deliver. So the focus of a learning objective is ever so slightly different to the focus for a learning outcome. It might sound like semantics as I'm talking about these, and to a large part it is, but people that understand what a learning outcome is expect to see a learning outcome that is learner-centric, that talks about what students will achieve. Learning objectives don't lend themselves to well-written assessments and questions that are setting students up to succeed. Okay, so that's just a quick kind of summary of learning outcomes, learning objectives, and the differences between the two. Getting the learning outcomes right means that when we implement the teaching, the learning, and ultimately the assessment, we're producing well-written assessments that assess in a valid, reliable, fair, and impactful way. First off is the idea that not all assessment types are good for different situations. So again, looking at the difference in the qualifications that we offer, they are broadly split down the lines of knowledge and competence. And particularly for the Reg portfolio, you might have seen the mapping document where we use the filled in circles and the hollow circles to show the difference between knowledge and competence. It's quite important to understand that certain assessment types do lend themselves better to different types of knowledge and skills and competence that you are assessing. So, for example, case studies are really good at assessing competence, but they're not as good at assessing knowledge. Practical tasks, as you would imagine, are really good for assessing competence. They're not great for knowledge. Often you will find that assessments need to bridge this gap between knowledge and competence. And so part of asking the right question is being clear in your own head when you write the assessment material, what's most important? Is it most important that I check the knowledge that the students got because we can deal with competence issues another way? Or is it most important actually here that we focus on the competence for this particular skill and we can worry about the knowledge in, somewhere else in another context? So again, be clear as you're writing assessment tasks whether the focus of what you're trying to assess is an individual's knowledge or their competence. And as you do this, think about the authenticity of your assessment. Now, authentic assessment is a big thing in the HE sector at the minute. And the idea behind authentic assessment is that you are assessing students in a context that is relevant for their workplace and their and the real world challenges and context that they will experience there. So the best authentic assessments are based in the workplace, in the context of where that skill or where that knowledge will be used routinely through that person's working life. And the very best authentic assessments will require application of knowledge to a new situation. Okay, you can QC that machine over there, but can you apply any of those QC skills from that instrument to this instrument over here? Okay, so authentic assessment is a really big thing at the minute. And so students are starting to come out of university with much more authentic assessment method, exposure to much more authentic assessment methods than they may have done when some of us were at university. So there is a bit of a shift going on at the moment there. So the three most common assessment tasks that I saw when I did a bit of a look through what evidence comes in through the Reg portfolio at the minute were multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and essay-based questions. So what I'm going to do now is spend the next 5 or 10 minutes talking predominantly about these, because looking at the material that comes into the OneFile platform, we see really broad practice against all three of these assessment types. Some of them are underpinned by other things as well. So it may be that people are using short answer questions to interpret a paper, or they might be using an essay-based question as part of a case study. So although I'm going to focus on these as three distinct entities, there is an awful lot of overlap between other assessment methods as well. So I'll try to bring those in as we go through. Fundamentally, there is this misinterpretation that multiple choice questions only test basic factual knowledge. That's not true. Multiple choice questions can be used to test very high level advanced thinking and higher order learning, but they're much harder to write at that higher level. Multiple choice questions are really good if you've got lots of people involved in training, because they reduce marking subjectivity. As we'll see in a minute, with a multiple choice question, there's usually just one right, there should just be one right answer. So it does bring a level of objectivity. The problem with multiple choice questions is that if you need an element of reasoning behind it, it's much harder to write a good multiple choice question. Because as you will know from your own experience at work, when you ask people to give reasons why and to explain why they've made a particular choice or to justify a particular action, the terminology and wording that individuals use is so very different. So multiple choice questions are good for reducing subjectivity, but they're hard if you need to do any kind of deep reasoning, particularly that requires a number of hops from one idea to another, because everybody's got their own way of describing that. And the words that you put in the answer to a multiple choice question just might not resonate with the person who's answering that question. So it falls down on fairness and validity. Short answer questions are really good to cover a broad range of scenarios and a broad range of information. The problem with short answer questions is it's really hard to write them so that you only get a short answer. Many short answer questions that you see written actually end up with essay-based responses to it. And it's not usually because the student doesn't appreciate that you've asked them to briefly describe or briefly explain or whatever the question might be. It's very often because the boundary of the question isn't tight enough for the student to feel that in 2 or 3 sentences they've given you enough information for you to be happy with the response that they've given. So short answer questions are great for going beyond simple recall and getting more of the problem solving, the deeper reasoning from a student in words that they understand. But it's really hard to write it to mark objectively and also to get that tight short answer that you're looking for. We'll come on to some strategies in a couple of minutes as to how we can get over some of those problems. Essay-based questions are the mainstay of the higher level qualifications, because traditionally they're used to assess high order thinking. They're used to do the very high levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the analysis, the synthesis, the evaluative type stuff. Essay-based questions are really good for getting justifications, for getting very deep reasoning, and for measuring the ability of people to communicate. The big problem with essay-based questions is how authentic are they? On a daily basis, how many of us actually write what would be considered an essay level response? We very seldom do it. So if we're thinking about authentic assessments, then maybe essay-based questions don't have quite the place that they did before. Instead, you could switch it to a case study with short answer questions. You could even switch it to read a paper and then answer these multiple choice questions if the multiple choice questions are structured at the right level for the level of the information that you're seeking from the learner. One of the things that I will say, and it picks up on the point I made a couple of minutes ago, is when it comes to designing assessment tasks nowadays, AI can absolutely be a massive friend, because what you can do is you can give the AI, let's take that last example that I've just given you there. You could give the AI the materials and methods section of a paper, and you could then say, write 3 higher order MCQ questions that will assess the knowledge in here. In this materials and methods section. So you can absolutely use AI to help you, particularly if you are not too experienced on writing higher order MCQ questions and that kind of thing. You use the tool. Similarly, maybe write the assessment to get your student to do some of this work for you. What I'll do now is I will go through these 3 kind of key domains, the multiple choice, so that the really rapid fire, easy, quick response type questions. And again, multiple choice is the heading, but there are other things that are going to fall in there. Short answer questions and essay-based questions. Picking some examples out of the Reg portfolio, good examples and bad examples, and we'll talk through how we can get to the right question. First of all, multiple choice questions, best practice. First thing is, make sure that the wording is clear and precise. This is the biggest problem with multiple choice questions, is that words are ambiguous, or you try and focus on too many concepts in one question. So with MCQ, one concept, one question. Classic mistake made with multiple choice questions when you write them is the distractors. So in academic speak, a distractor in a multiple choice question is a wrong answer. Use plausible wrong answers. I think a comment bubble just popped up there that somebody was saying that students just, they learn the right answer. They learn the one phrase. They learn to the assessment rather than learning to the knowledge base that they will need for the rest of their career. The best thing you can do with a multiple choice question is use a wrong answer that is a common misconception. So if people, let's say there's been a change in, I don't know, a reference range in hematology. Maybe we now use milligrams per milliliter instead of micromoles per mole, or whatever it might be. Use a common misconception. Maybe use an American reference standard instead of a British one, because that will then give you a heads up as to where the students may be getting their information from if they're not getting it directly out of training material that you're providing to them. Plausible distractors are what make multiple choice questions hard. Keep your answer choices balanced, because the other thing that makes it really easy for a student to guess the right answer on a multiple choice is if one of the answers is more complex or longer or shorter than the others. So keep the answer choice balanced. Make sure that the answer structure matches the STEM. So which of the following is a reference range for, I don't know, serotonin? And I'm not a biochemist, so if I'm getting this wrong, I'm really sorry. Which of the following is a normal reference range for serotonin? Don't then give a specific number as one of the answers and all 3 of the others being a range. Okay, so make sure that the answer structure matches the STEM. If you're asking for a reference range, make sure that all of your answers are ranges. Avoid negatively phrased MCQs. They're considered really bad practice. So you'll see it all over the place. Which of the following is not true? The reason these questions crop up is because it's really easy to write 3 obviously not true statements. So Questions that are phrased in a negative way are easy for us as assessors and trainers and practitioners to write, but they often cause lots of confusion in students. So avoid them if you can, but if you can't, make sure it's really clear that you are asking for which of the following is not true. Similarly, avoid all of the above and none of the above options, because students, again, will often guess at this as being an answer. Students, if they know that one of them has to be true, they will instantly know that none of the above, if you've used that as an answer, cannot possibly be true. So it allows them to just do a process of elimination to get to the right answer or guess. What it doesn't do is require them to know the right answer in advance. One of the other things that you should avoid with multiple choice as well is always having a predictable structure. So don't have the right answer being A, then B, then C, then D. And then when you get to question 5, go back to A again, because they'll just guess that there's a pattern, particularly if they start to see it. The only time that's ever worked is in the University of Oxford, who gave a multiple choice exam a few years ago, and they structured it so that every multiple choice question had the letter B as the correct answer. And the logic there was, if a student really knows their stuff, they won't be worried that it is the same letter for every answer, because they'll know that they are right, rather than they're seeing a pattern that can't possibly be true. So randomize the position of correct answers, make sure there's just one right answer, and with multiple choice questions particularly, make sure that you pilot the question first. You must make sure that these questions are valid, because there's no opportunity with a multiple choice question for a student to give you something other than what you've written there. Okay, so if they think, well, I think it's this, but I wouldn't have used that word, then you're not giving them that opportunity with an MCQ. So just make sure that you pilot them, test them, and if necessary, revise and go back to them again. A couple of examples that I've seen here, good and bad examples. On the left is an example of an MCQ, and on the right is an MCQ that fundamentally assesses exactly the same information. Okay, the question on the left is considered to be a good example because it's valid, it's reliable, it's fair. It follows all of those ideas about linking to a smart learning outcome. And you can see that we've not used all of the above, we've not used none of the above, we've given plausible distractors. So a student really does need to know what the right answer is there in order to get that question right. Short answer questions often accompany case studies. So if you're giving case study based work, quite often the question structures that you will ask your students in relation to a case study are short answers. Similarly, short answer questions are really good to come from practical demonstrations as well, because you can do them as relatively quick fire things. Remember as well that just because I'm talking here about a short answer question and we're doing it all on a PowerPoint presentation with written words, a short answer question doesn't have to be a written response. So short answer questions could be a series of 5 really quick fire questions that you ask after a student has demonstrated something. Or it could be something that they do after they've given you a little bit of a presentation about something they've developed or looked into. The key with a short answer question is that it needs a specific but brief response. If it is written, keep it to a short 2 or 3 sentence long thing. Careful command verb usage is what you're going to find here is the key to getting this question right. If you don't want an essay type response, or you don't want a response where a student's talking to you for the next 10 minutes, make sure you give a really concise command verb. And it could be that you just say in the written format, describing no more than 50 words or explaining no more than 100 words. That asks them to keep it concise. It could be that if you're doing this as an oral thing, that you could say, describe how you've just done that in phrases that a 15-year-old would understand, or describe how you've done that as if you were doing it. It's one thing I did once, and it was weird, but it worked. Describe how you're doing it in the form of a radio jingle. So just give some kind of scaffold to say, I need you to keep this concise and I need you to keep it short. The best short answer questions actually stem from oral questioning, because oral questions are very often problem solving. They're problem based. They're very often based on application as well. So think about the oral questioning that you do if you're looking for a series of short answer written questions, and convert what you do orally into the written form if necessary. Try not to be overly broad, and try and directly assess an intended learning outcome. Don't ask a short answer question about something that's just trivial knowledge, because that's not really what they're focused for. If it's trivial knowledge, why was it part of a learning outcome? Try and frame the question to maximize understanding. So explain why rather than what is a classic confusion here. Ensure the question has got one best answer. And again, if you're doing this as part of a training team, you need to have a clear marking scheme. Short answer questions are really hard to write marking schemes for, because everybody will word things in a different way. One of the ways that you can bring objectivity to a marking scheme for a short answer question is by adopting an answer structure. So, for example, it might be, and this is an example that you'll see used in the compulsory education sector. So when people are marking GCSE and A-level scripts, you will often see here that if there is a word that is required as part of an answer, the mark scheme will stipulate it. So the mark scheme usually puts a word in bold in an A-level paper if that word must be in the answer to demonstrate part of the understanding. So if you do need to just bring objectivity to your marking schemes, then make sure that anybody else who's involved in training, anybody else who's involved in marking, knows that if you've underlined a word, it's because you require it to be there for that marker to mark the question as being right. If you are happy for alternative wording, then say it in your marking scheme so that every other trainer knows that the wording here doesn't matter. It's the concept that I'm looking at. Again, maybe build that into your question. If it's more the concept that you're interested in rather than the specific terminology, let the candidates know that, let the students know that as you're writing the question. Avoid double-barreled questions that ask more than one thing at once. And again, try and avoid negative phrasing if you can, because it's which of these is not whatever. It's just not helpful. It doesn't demonstrate learning against learning outcomes. Some examples that I've seen in the Reg portfolio, again, a couple of good examples and bad examples. Here, fasting plasma glucose level, yeah, brilliant, lovely. What additional steps are taken to confirm it? This is a good question because it focuses on specific lab results rather than just recalling a value. Anybody can recall a value, and if somebody isn't recalling that value directly in front of you, how do you know they didn't just go and look it up prior to giving you that information? This question starts to test clinical reasoning because it's asking about what the student will do next. What's the next thing that will happen here? And in this particular example, it encourages just thinking a little bit more broadly as to what other confirmation or supplementary tests might be needed. Compare that with this example, what laboratory tests are used to diagnose diabetes. Well, you could just list them and get the answer to this question right. There's no clinical context, so there's none of that deeper reasoning, deeper understanding required here, and it doesn't assess the ability to actually interpret any of those tests that are used to diagnose diabetes. Essay-based questions, again, can take the form of a written essay, but they could also take the form of, give me a 15-minute presentation on, I want you to give a seminar to everybody else about. So again, just because I've called it an essay-based question doesn't mean that's necessarily what it is. These assess the higher cognitive skills right at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. So they're not usually suitable for competence, they're more about knowledge. Make sure that they address the knowledge that's specifically referenced in the learning outcomes. Make sure that you're explicit about the scope and the expectation so that you're not reading through thousands and thousands of words when actually you only wanted 500 to 700. Make sure that you provide focus. Make sure that you provide clear marking criteria so that everybody knows in advance what it is that you're looking for, in particular, in this response. Make sure that you use open-ended prompts, because it might be that you're looking for something specific in the answer, but the student comes in and blindsides you with something that is just as relevant, that's just as correct, but isn't what you were inferring when you wrote the question. So you need to make sure that you allow for those diverse perspectives to come in. Again, a good and a bad example out of the Reg portfolio. I've stuck with diabetes. Discuss the laboratory diagnosis, comparing different diagnostic tests in terms of mechanism, sensitivity, specificity, and clinical application. We've pretty much opened the door there for any angle on the laboratory diagnosis of diabetes, whereas describe the laboratory tests used to diagnose diabetes ain't great as an essay because it's using a very low level command verb. It's not scaffolding the response at all, and it's not providing a clear focus. So then what you need to do is make sure that through assessment, feedback and marking, you're focusing on the strengths and areas for improvement. The reason that you're doing this is, yes, to help the learner, but it's actually also to make sure that you, as the person who wrote the assessment, is able to rinse, repeat, and go again with this particular assessment style. Can you reliably use this question again to get the information out of a student? Or do you actually just need to revisit it and think again? Make sure that in that feedback, you are clear, you don't use technical or complex language, and that feedback is easy for the student to understand. Because fundamentally, what you really need to make sure that you asked the right question at this stage in the process is to engage in a dialogue with the student to make sure that what you've read on the page or what you've heard in a presentation or in a leaflet not only matches the information that you were expecting to get from the student, but that their expectations and yours were aligned in the first place, because that's the key to writing or creating the right question, that your expectation and the expectation of the student is aligned all the way through the process. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much. I've gone right to the wire.
You did, right up to the 1 o'clock. There's been lots of comments about people finding it really helpful, Jim, and really useful towards the end, but needing to go to other meetings, so they're going to catch up at the end. I think we've caught a lot of the questions on the way through, haven't we, Tamina? So there was just one at the end around Turnitin on one file for the Reg portfolio.
Yeah,
so
I knew that had come in somewhere as soon as I mentioned
is it switched
AI.
On?
Yeah, it is switched on. Yeah.
So I'm just going to check back through. Is there anything we didn't answer, Tamina? I can't see anything.
I can't see any questions that we've missed. I think we've addressed most of them.
Yeah. I'm just going to look for one that came in. So it was Leah. So Leah asked a question about MCQs and competency assessment and knowledge, and we should really be combining them together. So I gave it a thumbs up. So I think you weren't saying they need to be separate things, but if you are asking separate things.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Does that make sense, Leah? So absolutely, it should be tell us what you know and how you use it.
Yeah.
But it sometimes is easier, depending on the way you ask the question, to say it's a knowledge or a competence based one.
Absolutely. And the key is, yeah, like I said a few minutes ago, it's about just making sure that you're clear in your head about what is most important in this question that I'm asking. Is it most important that they demonstrate the knowledge or the competence? Can I pick up the other one somewhere else?
Lovely. So I think because we've kind of got up to the time, if it's all right, if anybody's got any other questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we can answer them for you. But if not, thank you very much to everybody for coming. Everyone seems to find it really useful, Jim. So thank you very much for taking the time to put all of that together. And if you did come along and you know colleagues who weren't able to get here, then please do tell them that the links are on that webpage. If you look under webinars and support hubs, you'll find them straight away. So pass that on to everybody. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, for giving up your time. Thank you, Jim, for presenting. Thank you, Tamina, for coming along as always and starting off the session today and supporting us. So have a good afternoon, everyone. Hope you get to enjoy some sunshine and see you at the next one.